Hello, everyone. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. It's wonderful to see so many of you tuning in. I can see you all arriving, so welcome. I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the How To Academy, and so pleased we can still bring brilliant speakers to you at the click of a Zoom button. And I'm particularly thrilled to welcome Dr. Lisa Mosconi this evening, or this afternoon, or perhaps this morning, depending on where you're tuning in from, to discuss the fascinating and really trailblazing theories that she lays out in her new book, which I have, of course, here, The XX Brain, the groundbreaking science empowering women to prevent dementia, which is, of course, the inspiration for this event. And it really is essential reading. I think I've underlined and highlighted almost every line, so apologies to the publishers for vandalizing the book so considerably, but it's a compelling exploration of women's brains and looks at how they age distinctly from men's and what we can all do to protect and nurture them. And these are all things that have been largely missing from so much scientific research in the past, but she is certainly on a mission to put it firmly back on the agenda. And of course, is a pioneer in the field, the director of the Women's Brain Initiative and the associate director of the Alzheimer's Prevention Clinic at Wells Cornell Medical College, and also an associate professor of neuroscience and neurology and radiology there. And formerly, and you'll see, becomes very relevant, director of the Nutrition and Brain Fitness Lab. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to try and talk as little as possible because everybody has tuned to hear from you and not me, and there'll be a chance for questions at the end. So I just like to dive straight into where you start in your introduction, and you say that you wrote the book in the aftermath of the Me Too movement. How did that inform your thinking? How are they connected? Is this book in a way part of that?
That's a really good question. I don't know if the book is part of that. I find that the Me Too movement, just the fact that women's rights are once again really at the forefront in our culture, not just for women, but also for many incredible men who really want to promote women's rights and equality, that really helped research tremendously. So for context, I am a neuroscientist, I'm a brain scientist. And I've been trying to look at women's brains for 20 years from the very beginning of my career in the field. And I was really having a hard time getting funding to do so. It was just not a priority. But after Me Too, with more and more women really demanding accurate information about their health and also their brain health, more and more scientists like myself, I feel like we really felt empowered to say it's not just women's rights. We also really have a huge gap in research where it doesn't take a scientist to really denounce the fact that women's rights and women's physical, legal, and financial security remain inequitable, but it does take a scientist and the clinician and the doctor to really denounce the fact that women are also overlooked medically, where our needs go way too often unacknowledged and unaddressed. And this really needs to change. And around the same time, the NIH, which is the American equivalent of the NHS, really stepped up. And they've been funding research now steadily for years. And so have many other foundations, Maria Shriver's Women Alzheimer's Movements, the Cure Alzheimer's Funds, they all fund research. So it's been incredibly empowering, but also such a relief that finally this is a priority. Women's brains are finally being discussed and investigated and researched in an accurate way.
And in that research, one of the things you talk about is bikini medicine.
Yeah.
What is it?
What is that?
What are you referring about bikini medicine?
So bikini medicine is a rather unfortunate term, but is a catchy term that really describes how historically medical professionals behaved as if and really believed the men and women were essentially the same person with different reproductive organs. So those parts of the body that really fit under a bikini. So setting those parts aside, as if one could, really meant that doctors would diagnose and treat both sexes the same exact way. And that's really problematic because our brains are not the same, our hearts are not the same, our lungs are not the same, our intestines are not the same. And all the research for a really long time was done in men. So something happened in the 1960s that led to women being actually excluded from medical research, especially from experimental clinical trials. And that's until it went all the way through the 1990s. So we have 30 years of medical research that had no women in it, and therefore was not informed by women either. And so if you put the two things together, right, all the research is done in men, and people don't believe that women's brains are different from men's brains, and the results is that women's brain health is still today one of the most under-researched, underdiagnosed, and undertreated fields of medicine. Which is a shame, because women are half of the population and we're mothers to the other half. Yeah. So we really deserve better than that. We can do better than that, and we deserve better.
And is that why, you know, it's your passion that's driven your passion, but you have also personal reasons? I mean, what sort of prompted your mission and fuels your commitment to studying this so intently?
Yeah, so I'm from Florence in Italy. We were just talking about that. And my parents are both nuclear physicists, both of them, which really makes for an interesting childhood in many ways. And my mom was teaching nuclear physics to students who were babysitting me, but also then transferred to medicine and went to work in nuclear medicine, which is that branch of radiology that uses radioactive isotopes to look at brain biochemistry and functionality, which I always find incredibly fascinating. So as soon as I was 19 and I went to college, I reached out to them and I said, can I volunteer? I always wanted to study the brain, always, 100%. Around that time, my grandmother started showing signs of cognitive decline. It was so evident because she was such a strong, intelligent, really brilliant woman, and she was having such difficulties. And within a few years, it was just clear that she had Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And just a few years later, her two youngest sisters also developed exactly the same disease, to the result that there were 4 siblings, 3 sisters and 1 brother, and all 3 sisters developed dementia and died of it, whereas the brother did not. And so that was really heartbreaking and shocking and frightening in so many ways. I was worried about me, I was worried about my mom. And I went to my supervisors and to my colleagues. At that point, I was doing my PhD in nuclear medicine, neuroscience. And I said, we were looking at Alzheimer's disease, we were studying Alzheimer's disease, and I asked, but does it matter if you're a woman? You know, is it worse for women? Do women get it more? And the answer was like, oh, you know, sweetie, it's just that women live longer than men, and Alzheimer's disease is a disease of old age. So of course, more women than men get Alzheimer's, and that's about it. You know, it's just like, it's not a question worth looking into almost. And it wasn't just my team who felt that way, it was the entire field. Like a few years later, it turned up statistically that women represent 2/3 of the entire Alzheimer's population, which really means that for every man suffering from Alzheimer's, there are 2 women. And still there was this bias against women in a way that was like, well, you live longer, so really there's not much we can do about it. So it took a long time to turn this around and reshape the conversation in a way that really does justice to the fact that it's not just that women live longer at all.
It's so many things that you write about in the book, all the other things that it is. I mean, you say far more than our breasts and our tubes, our brains are under the greatest threat. But
right.
It all comes down to the fundamental differences you talk about between then a female and a male brain. I mean, what are they?
So there are so many differences between a woman's brains and a man's brain that are not necessarily structural or anatomical. And I do want to point out, I'm not a psychologist, so when people come to me and say, is it true that men are from Mars and women are from Venus? I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. It's not my thing. It's not pink and blue, Barbie and Lego. This is not my territory. What we look at are really raw biological, physiological, hormonal difference, biochemical differences that really render each person's brain very peculiar, very unique. And there are definite differences between women's brains and men's brains in a very real way, like unjudgmental way. It's not like, women's brains are better or worse. It's just that we're a little bit different. We're built a little bit differently. We're wired a little bit differently. Most importantly, we age a bit differently. And all these differences put together are really important for our health, because it's not just Alzheimer's disease, which is, however, a huge threat because just of the numbers, right? We're expecting 130 million Alzheimer's patients globally by the year 2050, which is a huge amount of patients. And we know that more likely than not, 2/3 might end up being women. So that's a huge threat to women's health. But also, women are twice as likely as men to be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder or depression. We're 3 times more likely to develop an autoimmune disorder, including those that attack the brain, like multiple sclerosis. We're 4 times more likely to have headaches and migraines. I have one right now. And as every man knows, right, women get headaches a lot. But we're also more likely to develop meningiomas, which is the most common form of brain tumor. And that's especially after menopause. And likewise, we're far more likely to die of a stroke, again, usually after menopause. So there's a whole thing that happens that we just don't talk about. Women have a harder time recovering from a traumatic brain injury. Women get traumatic brain injuries even more than men when we're not looking at sports, for example, in real life. Inflammation has a different effect in women's brains than men's brains. So there's a whole conversation that needs to happen. And in order to really have it, we need the research and we need data. We don't need opinions when it comes to women's health. We don't need blogs, internet blogs telling us to buy supplements. We need actual science.
And for people who are feeling a bit disheartened, we will come on
right.
we will come on to the reasons to be positive, because that's ultimately what you go away from all of this with. But let's stay on this for a little bit. I mean, there's a lot in there that perhaps we could explore in more detail. But can I first just ask you to just explain what you were saying? You're not saying, there's a lot of work at the moment to try and dismantle the idea of a gendered brain, because obviously it's used to justify the idea that, men's brains are wired differently and they are sort of, better therefore.
Better, yes. That's absolutely. Let's dismantle that 100%. I gave a TED talk about this just recently, and my opening is really, there is no such thing as a gendered brain. There's so many cultural stereotypes that have really taken advantage of the research to sell products, which is, again, is Barbie for girls and Lego for boys. But that really can escalate to even saying that when people say brilliance in mathematics is a male thing, right? That completely disregards the fact that men had access to higher education for much longer than women had. And there are plenty of brilliant female mathematicians. And there's even this article that came out in the Wall Street Journal as a reaction to my book, which I loved, that really talks a lot more about the bias, the gender bias that we had in brain research, where starting from Darwin all the way to very recent times, people would research differences between male and female brains by basically trying to prove that men's brains were better, right? So the assumption was that male brains were inherently better and more efficient than women's brains, just purely based on size, right? Men are overall a little bit bigger than women, and so are their brains. It's proportional, right? So if you don't account for overall head size, yes, your brain is bigger than mine, so what? But now we're learning that their brains are just a little bit different. Like they're wired better. In some absolute terms, men's brains are better at finding directions. And if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, that makes perfect sense, because back then, where our ancestors were out in the savannah hunting, they needed to be able to really find out where they were and go back to the cave and to the women, right? So this advantage is still in part a feature of a man's brain, whereas women have superior verbal memory, for example, right? Does it make you better or worse qualitatively? Does it mean that your behavior is going to be that much better? No, it doesn't. This is just really understanding human physiology, which I think is very empowering, especially when we need to address risks that are based on that physiology. So I'm really against that kind of...
Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely. And, you know, there are a lot of myths that you dispel in the book. And some of those are around the idea that genes are destiny. I mean, there is a genetic risk. Perhaps you can tell us about the risks that impact women most, whether they're genetic, medical, hormonal. You mentioned some.
Yes, and I think it's really important to talk about genetics because they're so complicated, and very often they're oversimplified in the news and by the media, and they lead to absolute panic. This is the case in the field of Alzheimer's disease, where when I started back then, most people really understood Alzheimer's as the consequence of either bad genes in your DNA or aging, or a combination of the two. And today, it really turns out that neither one of these alternatives is necessarily the case for most people. So there are genetic mutations that cause Alzheimer's disease, but they are found in less than 2% of the entire population. So they're not nearly as frequent or as prevalent as people think. There is a gene that I just want to mention so we can close the conversation on it. There's one gene that's called the apolipoprotein E, or ApoE, most people say APOE, that comes in 3 different forms, epsilon 2, epsilon 3, epsilon 4. The epsilon form has been associated with a higher risk of Alzheimer's. However, this gene is not a genetic mutation. It does not cause Alzheimer's. It just puts you at higher risk as compared to somebody who doesn't have it. It's a risk factor, like you said. And it does increase risk of Alzheimer's disease more in women than in men. However, again, it is not causative of Alzheimer's. And if you think about it, of all Alzheimer's patients, more than 60% do not have this gene. So it's really, it just came out in the news in England, especially because the studies show an association between COVID-19 and this specific gene that could potentially make COVID symptoms worse. So I just wanted to talk about it 1 second, because so many people reached out with concerns like, am I going to get COVID? Am I going to get dementia? And the answer is, it's important to know your genes if you also know what to do with the information, which is something that I really try to do in the book, and explain what this gene is and what it does, and what kind of things you can do to really keep your risk down and control your genes in a way by addressing your medical history and your lifestyle and all the things that are in your control. And so, closing this parenthesis a little long, it's important to talk about genetics. We have identified over 30 risk factors for Alzheimer's that affect women more than men, which are a lot. And I'll tell you something funny, actually. There's one risk factor for Alzheimer's, only one, that really seems to increase risk more for men than for women. And this risk is not being married to a woman. It's just really cute. Now, of course, the research was based on traditional families with the husband and the wife. But I think the point is, for men, not having a spouse or a partner, like not being in a stable relationship over time where you can count on somebody else's help, seems to increase the risk of dementia, because traditionally women have been in charge of taking care of the rest of the family. Right? And so making sure that the husband would go see the doctor and staying on top of medications. Did you remember to take your pill? Even my mom is always like to my dad, have you taken your medicines? And you need to go to the doctor, it's time for a clinic. But the point is really just being in a nurturing, supporting relationship seems to be really important, especially for men, which I think is kind of cute. For women, there's a new study that comes out in just a few weeks in a big journal in here. Well, it's an international peer-reviewed journal where we rank all possible risk factors in terms of their impact on brain aging and dementia risk in women. And the number one factor that always comes up on top is menopause. And that is very new. It's a very new finding that we've been looking into menopause a lot in these past years because we found this really strong connection between the transition to menopause and the potential onset of Alzheimer's disease brain changes in women. And this is really interesting because as a neuroscientist, as a brain scientist, the last thing I ever thought was that I'd be talking about menopause. Honestly, I didn't know what it was. Well, I knew what it was, but not from a neurological perspective. And it turns out that the menopause is really key to kind of kickstart brain aging in women, which is a very new finding. And I think it's something we really need to understand better because all women go through menopause. And so many people don't actually know that menopause not only changes your brain, but that it really starts in your brain.
Can you tell us more about the science of that? Why is there a link between menopause and Alzheimer's and dementia?
Right. So, well, why is a big question. I'll tell you what we know so far. So this is a fairly recent discovery. But so for context, many people think of their brains as being kind of isolated from the rest of the body. But in reality, our brains are very strongly connected to all the other systems in the body, all the other organs, and especially our reproductive system. Now, the interaction between the brain and the reproductive system is mediated by our hormones. And everybody knows that hormones differ somewhat between men and women. Men have more testosterone and women have more estrogens. Now, what's really important about these hormones is that they're not only involved in reproduction, they're also really strongly implicated in brain function. Both testosterone and estrogen, especially estradiol, which is one of three forms of estrogens, are literally, they supercharge your brain. They have so many functions in the brain that have nothing to do with having kids and everything to do with having energy. So at the cellular level, estrogen, for example, literally goes inside your neurons and pushes your neurons to burn glucose to make energy. So it's like estrogen kind of switches on your neurons so that they become more active and more energized. And so your entire brain has more energy. Also, estrogen is involved in immunity. So it really supports the immune system and makes your brain and your body really strong and resilient against aging, but also against disease. And is also really involved in plasticity and growth, not just in the rest of the body, but in your brain as well. So you can see in the first part of the menstrual cycle, like in animals, they did experiments, they see how the neurons literally grow, the little dendrites and the ramifications really grow during the first half of this menstrual cycle. And then they just kind of lose that growth during the second phase of the cycle when the estrogen goes down. So basically these neurons, these hormones, really energize the brain and keep it young and useful and resilient, which would be fantastic if women didn't go through menopause in their 50s or sometimes even earlier than that, because men don't lose their testosterone until much later on in life. It does decline, but the decline is kind of very gradual and usually mild. For women, we just lose this estradiol as we go through menopause in midlife. And that leaves the brain more vulnerable to a number of things. And maybe, do you want to show the brain scans that we did before?
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so tech support here. I'm going to share my screen. I have my slides up. I think you can see them. So this is a positron emission tomography or PET scan that looks at brain energy levels in the brain. And bright colors indicate high energy levels and dark colors indicate low energy levels. Now, it's normal to have a lot of dark inside the brain because there's fluids inside the brain, and fluids obviously don't have energy. So this is what you want your brain to look like when you're in your 40s, really nice and bright. And this brain belongs to a woman who was 43 years old when we scanned her the first time before menopause. Now, let me show you the same brain 8 years later when this woman went through menopause. I think you can see how the entire brain gets a little bit darker. And if we put them side by side, it's quite obvious how the bright yellow turned orange and the orange turned purple, right? So this is a 30% drop in brain energy levels. And it's not just this woman, this is average. This was defined on average in studies with hundreds and hundreds of people at this point. And importantly, this does not happen to a man of the same age.
So can we talk a little bit about what you then go on, and I think, you know, the third and very significant section of your book is the fact that we can minimize these risks. We can optimize our brain health. And to go looking at menopause, obviously one of the ways people can, and that you explore in great detail, maximize estrogen is by menopause hormonal treatment, which has been a very controversial thing. A lot of women are wary of it. Do you advocate that that can be a way to help symptoms of the menopause and also therefore help brain health?
Well, I would say that it makes a lot of sense to me as a therapeutic route. The point is we're losing estradiol at some point in our lives, and these changes manifest themselves as energy changes inside the brain that then really provoke the symptoms of menopause. So when women say that they're having hot flashes, night sweats, insomnia, depression, anxiety, brain fog, memory lapses, those symptoms, just to be clear, they don't start in the ovaries, they start in the brain. Those are neurological symptoms. We're just not used to talking about them as such. So it's really important to reconceptualize that, because so many women are really frightened by the menopause. They feel like they're going crazy, that they're losing their minds, that there's something going on inside their head. So I just want to, number one, validate this, because I feel like all I'm doing is just validate what women have been saying for hundreds of years, and just really providing proof and evidence that yes, something is changing. Now, is that something to be afraid of? No. It is a transition. Your brain is going through a transition, and it's time and support to adjust. And there are many ways to really support your brain through this transition that sometimes involve medications, like you mentioned, hormonal replacement therapy or menopause hormonal treatment. Sometimes they don't. I find that it's very individual, and everybody has different preferences. Like for me, if I can deal with whatever symptoms I'm hoping not to have when I go through menopause, if I can just handle that by means of having a healthy lifestyle with diet, exercise, stress reduction, sleeping correctly, staying away from pollutants, that's what I want to do. Yeah.
So I'd like to address all the lifestyle changes which you would advocate doing before medication. But can you just clarify, because you do spend a lot of time talking in the book about whether the risks are real or whether they're a myth when it comes to treatments?
To what treatment?
To hormone replacement therapy for an MRT.
Well, it depends on how you do it. So for a really long time, when these hormones first became available, doctors would prescribe really high doses of oral medications and would put women on these hormones for life. And we learned that that is not the right thing to do. Right now, most menopause specialists really use very low dosage of hormones, very often transdermal or topical. And this is a much gentler approach that works well for many women. I think what's really important is to understand who's eligible for treatment. There are many women who are not eligible for hormones. And I have a whole list in the book because I think it's really important to know if you have any of the risk factors that I mentioned in the book, then that's just not the safest route for you. You might still work with the right doctor to really supervise and monitor everything that is happening. But I feel like, at least in the United States, many women go to the doctor, you see your doctor for 7 minutes, you walk out of the doctor's office with a prescription, and then that's it. You're on your own for 6 months. So it really depends on you and on your doctor and the kind of relationship you have with your doctor. But in general, if you have risk factors for, obviously for cancer, for a number of conditions that going on hormones could potentially worsen, then you want to stay away from it and try something else first. In general, I would say try something else first. And the something else is really lifestyle based, although you do need medical supervision to make sure you don't have medical conditions that can make the symptoms worse.
So let's talk about as many of those lifestyle things as possible. I should say that, you know, you say again and again, for people who are wondering, it's not too late, because you always think, okay, I can't, you know, I've had an unhealthy, or I haven't done the things she's advocated up until now. But an important point you continually make is it isn't too late to start, as long as you take on your advice and actively do it for 3 or 6, between 3 and 6 months. That's right, isn't it?
Or more.
And then
it really has to be a lifestyle change.
Yeah.
Like I think that crash diets or going to the gym for 3 weeks every day and then not going anymore, it can only really bring you this far. I think it's really important to understand what kind of things we can do to really promote brain health, and also understand that health is not something that you achieve in 2 weeks and then you can just let go of it, right? It has to really become part of your lifestyle. I always say you want to treat your brain like your best friend, right? You want to understand what your brain wants and needs. And then those things really need to become part of our lifestyles. As a society, we're so focused on the way we look, right? Without thinking that those same lifestyle choices that you make also really influence the way you think, the way you feel, the way you remember information. So there are so many things that every woman can do today to really protect their brains and their hormones and the effects of the hormones on the brain. They don't necessarily require medications. They really require taking a good look at the way you live your life and then making choices for the best that are based on science. That's the whole goal of the book, to really bring the science and the research out of the lab and say, we do have the data in women. And the research says, this really helps you, this does not.
And one of the things you say is that the brain cries out for proper food, like no other entity in our body. And you look a lot at diet. You say that you don't favor, as you've said, sort of the diet fads of the past few years. We've had low fat diets, we've had Atkins, and at the moment we have the kind of ketogenic, I think that's the right diet. But one that you dismiss those, if I'm right, perhaps you could say why you propose that the Mediterranean diet is really the best brain diet you can imagine.
Well, I wouldn't dismiss any diet. I think what's really important is to work with patients. I say patients, but to work with people and really help them make the best choices for them. There are so many people who are on all sorts of diet. There's somebody I know who's on the peanut butter diet. And, you know, there's somebody else who just doesn't eat anything until lunchtime and then eats pizza all day long. You really have to work with people and try to make the right choices over time. And I think I do talk about the Mediterranean diet as a very healthy diet, especially for women, because that's what the research shows. Again, it's not my opinion. It's just that there are so many diets that come out, especially I think in the United States, you know, right now there's the carnivore diet. You just eat meat all day long. And it's going to be around for maybe a year or two, and then we're just going to swing right back into veganism. And I think it's really important to think of food as function. You know, all the foods and all the ingredients and the molecules that we put into our bodies have an effect, not just on our waistlines, but also our brains. And it's really important to understand what works for our brains. And time again, so many studies have shown that a Mediterranean style diet is really beneficial to women's health. So women on this diet, when you look at women who are on the Mediterranean diet as compared to those on a Western style diet, but whatever that means, but it's like a fast food, burgers, lots of meat and dairy and poor quality foods, I guess. The women on the Mediterranean diet have 3 times longer telomeres, which are a biological indicator of cellular youth. It really tells you how young your system is, your DNA is. They have a 25% lower risk of heart disease and stroke. They have a 50% lower risk of breast cancer, which is a big deal. They have a much lower risk of depression. They have fewer hot flashes. They have a later onset of menopause, and they also have a lower risk of dementia. And we have looked at the Mediterranean diet, perhaps because I'm Italian and I'm slightly biased, but I find it to be a very flexible diet. You know, you don't have to eat pasta or pizza, obviously. You don't have to move to Italy or Spain, but it's really mostly plant focused. So you get to eat a lot of fresh veggies and fruit and whole grains and legumes. There's fish, there's healthy vegetable oils. And meat and dairy, they're there on the menu. They're just not eaten breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And it's a balanced diet. It really favors fresh, good quality produce, which it's just common sense.
So which could you tell us are sort of brain foods that are a brain's best friend, and which are the brain foods that we should really avoid at all costs?
Right. So for women's brains specifically, our 3 best friends are, I'm going to tell you the nutrients and then we can talk about the foods. They're really antioxidants. So vitamin C and vitamin E are really important because the more you have in your diet, the better your brain energy levels are. So antioxidants are really important because our brains age, obviously. And as we age, we get more oxidative stress and free radicals in our brains. And you need to import antioxidants from the diet to really counteract that. And that's really veggies and fruit. It's extra virgin olive oil, it's citrus fruit, it's berries, it's veggies, it's green leafy vegetables and greens and broccoli and cruciferous vegetables and also nuts and seeds. So it's a lot of plants. Number 2 would be polyunsaturated fatty acids, especially omega-3s, and one type of omega-3 that is called DHA that is really abundant in fatty fish. So you can think about smash. So smash, that is for salmon, mackerel, anchovies, sardines, herring. Smash. All this, those are all really good sources of DHA. And if you don't eat fish, a lot of people don't like fish, then I think plant-based sources of omega-3s are just as good, like flax seeds, extra virgin olive oils, almonds, even chia seeds if you like them. Although it's unclear if they're actually good sources of omega-3s. And then the last nutrient on my list for women's brains would be phytoestrogens. We don't talk about that a lot, but the same way they were so interested in hormonal replacement therapy as a mean to introduce estrogens in the body, that same way we might want to turn to plants and diet for support, because so many plants and fruits and nuts and seeds and grains contain estrogens as they are, which is beautiful if you think that estrogen is the most ancient of hormones, which means that plants make estrogens, animals make estrogens, we make estrogens. And these estrogens can really go across species because they're so old, phylogenetically speaking. And so if you eat a lot of plant foods that contain phytoestrogens, that's effectively like a mild form of estrogen replacement therapy without the side effects and without the risks, unless you're allergic to some specific ingredients. Like soy is a really good source of phytoestrogens, but it's also a huge allergen. And so many people just can't process the soy or perhaps don't like it. But there are other foods that also contain phytoestrogens that have been shown to really improve health in many ways and reduce the risk of hot flashes in women as well. And they're mostly flax seeds, sesame seeds, dried apricots for whatever reason, chickpeas, legumes, whole grains, especially when you can eat the endosperm, or the grains, and then a number of fruits like strawberries, blueberries, and those are tropical fruits like mango, pineapple. Those are all really good for you. And also, dark chocolate contains a specific type of molecular catechine that can really boost production of phytoestrogen. So dark chocolate is good as well, which is good news.
So in this, because we don't have nearly enough time and there's so much more, I'm going to for the dietary requirements. People can obviously have a look at the book, and you say one of the things obviously to avoid at all costs, and that's
processed food
and processed food.
Yes.
Another thing, lifestyle that you talk about is exercise, which everybody knows, but it's not about. Exercise can really genuinely help where the brain is concerned and brain health in almost every way. And I was very interested by the fact you said it slightly down on the idea of intense exercise, so spinning and things like that, and more an advocate of exercise that's just a kind of a continuum, walking to places. You said even if you're someone who does the hoovering, but just being active rather than feeling you have to go and do a HIIT class.
Yes, and if you like it, good for you. But the research on thousands of women has shown that there's an inverted U-shaped relationship to exercise. So if you have gains, like cardiovascular gains up here, and you have intensity of the exercise down here, for low intensity, like no intensity exercise, obviously you have no gains, but then increases until you're up to a moderate intensity exercise, and then it goes back down. So for the average woman that's been looked at so far, especially after menopause, high intensity doesn't help you as much as moderate intensity does, provided that you do it often enough. So instead of going for intensity once in a while, you want to go for maybe moderate intensity, but really go for frequency. See, my Italian mouth can't quite say that. So frequency seems to be, and consistency seems to be more important than just intensity alone, which makes sense. It just really makes sense.
Yeah, and just in the last moments before I hand over, because I can see the questions mounting up, and I want to get through them as many as possible, but you talk about other ways that we can protect our brains, very important ways. One is to keep down stress, which I think you say is almost the most detrimental to brain health and affects women worse.
Right.
And then there are also a few other ways in terms of engaging intellect. Perhaps you could talk about those.
Yes, actually, I think it's really important to talk about stress, because everyone right now is under a lot of stress, just because of the way things are right now. So stress is the silent killer. We know that stress is really involved in every major cause of death, from heart diseases to lung cancer to Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And obviously, stress increases inflammation, and inflammation is bad news for your body and brain. But something we don't talk about enough is that stress can also literally steal your hormones, especially as women. What happens is that if your cortisol levels go up, and cortisol is the main stress hormone, your estrogen production goes down. And that is because they work in balance. So your body uses the same molecule, which is called pregnenolone, if anybody wants to know, to make both cortisol and estrogen. So if you need to make more cortisol because you're stressed out, all the pregnenolone, all the precursor is going to be moved towards the cortisol route, and your estrogen production is going to go down. So if you reduce stress level and reduce cortisol levels, if you bring them back to normal, your estrogen production can resume. So this is really important to know. Also, recent brain imaging studies with thousands of people has shown that chronic stress and high cortisol levels can really lead to memory declines already in midlife in both men and women. But for women, there's also brain shrinkage already when we're in our 40s and 50s. So this is something you don't want in your life. You don't want your brain to shrink when you're 50 years old. You just don't want it. And if the problem is stress, then we need to be creative and find ways to really keep stress at bay. And something I want to tell you, because I know you'll appreciate it, is that we are all familiar with the fight or flight reaction. Well, that was based on men. So all the research on stress for many, many years was done really by looking at men's reaction to stress. And men react to stress with this fight or flight reaction, either punch you in the face or run for the hills, which was very helpful a million years ago, right? When our ancestors were fighting in the savannah and they had to either kill the tiger or run away from it. But women back then, they were not fighting. They were staying back with the kids and the elderly. And so fighting was impractical, obviously, with little kids all over you. And so it was running away. So women's brains developed an alternative reaction. So when you have the fight or flight reaction, which women have too, there's a surge of adrenaline and cortisol and norepinephrine. That's in men's brains. In women's brains, after that happens, the brain just releases like a wave of oxytocin, which is the love hormone. That really meant that women back then had the instinct to just go grab the children and help each other out and support each other out and fight the predator together, right? And this reaction is still ingrained in our DNA and in our brains, which translated to modern days means that women might need to reach out to other women for support in case of stress, right? So this is an instinct. It's not just you're a woman, you need to have your call with your friends. Your brain really needs social support and really hand-holding. And if you can do that, if that's your thing, don't be afraid to ask for help. Just reach out to your friends and your family, of course, as much as you can. If you're an introvert like me, perhaps you just want to do some yoga, or whatever works for you. Exercise is great. Sleep, obviously, is great, but nobody sleeps these days. And meditation is also another really important way to reduce stress. And there's now solid research showing that meditation, like having a consistent meditation practice, even just 12 minutes a day, and they describe it in the book, can really improve blood flow to the brain and reduce cortisol levels and reduce inflammation and just serve as a kind of antidepressant, especially in women with subjective cognitive complaints, which means forgetfulness already, and women under stress, especially caregivers. So it's something to look into. Do you meditate?
I try. I go through stages where I do, and I know that you advocate that certainly in the book, and there are lots of different ways, and it's incredibly helpful. You give very detailed instructions. I'm actually going to combine. Someone was asking. I just had a quick flick through something that I do think is important that you address, and I know a lot of people want to know about alcohol. And how much that affects brain health. Should we be drinking alcohol at all, or?
Oh, this is the first time I actually hear this question. So cool. Nobody here ever asked. So what's really interesting about alcohol and caffeine is that stimulants are metabolized differently in a woman's brain and body based on the menstrual cycle. So when your estrogen is high, so in the first half of your cycle, you need a lot less of the stimulants to get the same effect, to get an effect. Whereas during the second half of your cycle, you need twice as much or even more than that to get the same kind of reaction. So it's important to know that, because there's a tendency to perhaps overdo it during the second half of the cycle. In terms of brain health, there is research showing that if you drink alcoholic beverages that contain antioxidants, like red wine especially, that can have a positive effect on the brain. Is it the alcohol that has the positive effect? No, it's the antioxidants in the beverage. So I would say that if you don't like red wine and you drink pomegranate juice, they have a similar antioxidant capacity. It's just a different experience. So do we advocate for drinking alcohol for brain health? Nah, not necessarily. Is it a treat and something that people enjoy? Yes. So the important thing is to know that there's a threshold, right? So the recommended dose for a man is like 2 small glasses of red wine per day. Women metabolize alcohol faster, so one glass a day seems to be beneficial to women's brains without causing
and you advocate that you know, as people know, but often forget, drinking water is the most
Yes.
important of all the things. I think you said a glass of warm water in the morning is your
Yes.
all-time top tip for brain health.
One off for sure. I do it every morning and it really makes a huge difference for me, but it just really makes sense. So cold water is a vasoconstrictor, whereas warm water is a vasodilator. So if you drink warm water, you get rehydrated much faster than if you drink water that is cold or at room temperature. And usually people don't drink at night. So you wake up in the morning, that you're in need of fluids, and the easiest way is to drink warm water. When people say drink warm water with lemon juice, there's a reason for that. You know, you rehydrate much faster and the juice is absorbed a lot quicker. And I also always recommend it. This is a little tip when you go for a blood draw or any procedure that involves a needle. You always want to drink warm water about 20 minutes prior, like a big glass, because it really makes your veins pop. And then people like me don't have to prick you a number of times. It just goes right in.
Well, someone asks, and I think this is a very important question. I often wonder this myself. You hear about good stress and bad stress, and they're saying, is stress in the form of fast-paced, interesting, challenging work to be avoided? They say after menopause. And I wonder, just in general, are there types of stress that are actually good for us and our brains?
Right. I would call that a challenge more than stress, right? So there's an acute stress response, and then there's chronic stress. I think stress in general has a negative connotation, but if you mean like tension or the necessity to get something done at a specific time, like a deadline, that in a way could be beneficial because it keeps you on your toes, right? And you want your brain to be active. I think intellectual stimulation rather than stress is probably a good way to put it. Like you want your brain. I feel like a lot of people feel very active, very energized when they're working towards something. There's a challenge, there's a goal. And that is in part because learning is to your brain what exercise is to your muscles. Learning, whenever there's a learning curve, whenever you're achieving something, your brain really rejoices because that's really when your neurons are firing the most. And that is the number one, is the first principle of neuroscience. It's called the principle of Hebs. The neurons that fire together wire together. So the way the neurons form connections with each other is to really, is through learning. And learning makes your neurons fire and look for other neurons to create new associations and speed up the system. And that really creates a very resilient brain, which is a way to address this question to say that if you're doing something that's keeping you intellectually stimulated, even on edge, but in a positive way, then that's good. Yes.
I'm going to ask two questions at once.
Okay.
To follow on from that, and I know that you talk about it in your book, people are wondering whether brain games and Sudoku and crosswords are very good for brain health. And another thing that people were wondering if you could clarify, we talked at the beginning about genetic risk, and if you could clarify whether you're talking about early or late onset Alzheimer's when it comes to that.
Right. So for the first question, brain games seem to be mildly effective. So if you're not learning anything, then they're not useful. If you are learning as you go through these games, like let's say, I never play Sudoku. And actually, I don't know what you can learn from that, but crossword puzzles, right? At some point you learn something you didn't know before, or you have this intuition where you're like, oh, that's what it is. That's good. That's a good moment for your brain. However, learning is a little bit different. It's not as instantaneous. It's more of a process. So what really seems to make a difference, for example, is to learn to play an instrument, right? Play a musical instrument, or learn a new language, or brush up the language that you used to speak and now you haven't done it in a while, like French for me, which is technically my second language. Or if you like to read books, read a challenging book, not just a novel. Or if you like to watch television, you can watch a documentary or a TED Talk. Or if you like to play a game like chess, playing more chess will not help your brain nearly as much as learning to play bridge. So that's my answer. You need to challenge yourself and feel it. You need to feel that your brain is really there in the moment. For the genetic part, So there are two different forms of Alzheimer's disease. There's an early onset form that is usually very strongly based on family history. And there's a late onset form. So the early onset form is defined as being genetically determined, in that we have 3 genetic mutations that are autosomal dominant in 3 genes, like the APP and the presenilin 1 and 2 genes. These genetic mutations are very highly penetrant and they run in families. So here we're talking about families with a lot of family members affected. If you have the genetic mutation, you have a 99% chance of getting Alzheimer's. So the penetrance is very high. This early onset form of Alzheimer's leads to an overproduction of Alzheimer's plaques in a person's brain very early on in life. And most of the patients develop the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease when they're in their 40s. It could be in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, very rarely after age 60, 62. This is the early onset form. It is familial. You have a lot of affected patients in affected family members in your family, and there's a genetic mutation involved. It's very aggressive. Then there's the late onset form, which is usually an age of onset after age 60, more likely than not after age 65. There aren't as many family members affected, and there are no genetic mutations involved. So very often I have patients come into me, participants come in and say, I'm so worried because my mom has early onset Alzheimer's disease. And they say, or my dad, like, oh my goodness, how old is your mother? 70. So, well, that's not early onset. Or 65, right? I'm like, that's not early onset. Early onset is really 50, which is not in any way to underestimate the heartbreak and the concerns. But there doesn't seem to be a genetic mutation involved, which is good news for the children, right? And then there's the whole thing about testing that I really get into in the book.
And yeah, people could see, advocate going and making sure as an individual you find out the best test for you and how you can evaluate your own individual risk. There's so
always with genetic counseling. I am not a big fan of 23andMe or direct to consumer tests because they don't provide counseling and we have no idea how accurate they are. There are so many false positives. So
yeah. So we only have 2 minutes. I'm so sorry. So many wonderful questions that I'm sure we can find a way of perhaps doing a Q&A, a separate Q&A. But I just wanted to, if I'm allowed to reassure the person who says that they're 72, does it all still apply, the advice, or am I too late? You very much say it still applies.
Yes, it most certainly still applies. So this is really common sense, right? If you start making the right changes when you're 40, you can cut yourself some slack here and there. If you really change your lifestyle when you're 72, I would say be very consistent to achieve the same level of results. Just be very consistent. Really make it a strong focus for yourself on a daily basis. It's never too late. It's never too late. The sooner we start taking care of our brains, obviously the better it is, but it's never too late. And I know that it takes discipline and sometimes it feels like, oh my goodness, do I need to eat more blueberries? But really the benefits are for life and it's totally worth it. And I promise it's not painful. All the recommendations in the book, and I think Hannah can also say, maybe you can say that it's true. I'm not just making it up. It's very doable. It's very doable.
As you emphasize, that's why I said at the beginning that the positivity and the encouragement is there, because there are practical things, exercise, diet, and lists of what you should and shouldn't eat, and you've touched on so many of them, and I wish we could talk for longer, but I'm wary at the end of a Zoom session that the screen might go dark on us. So thank you very, very much to all of the people who've tuned in. I wish I could see all your faces, but I can't. And Lisa, thank you so very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure. And I really encourage all women to really start thinking about their brains as something to celebrate and to really value, because we're so conditioned to not think about the brains that way. If I have 1 second to just say, men age and we think of them as wine. The older they get, the more precious they become. And then women age and it's more like milk. Right? There's this expiration date after which people wonder, she's still good, does she need Botox? I find it so incredibly offensive and humiliating and so unnecessary. And I urge all women to really focus on what we can accomplish intellectually and mentally. And who cares what you look like? I mean, obviously you want to look good to yourself, but all these standards just as unsustainable and unreachable. And what really matters is your brain, your mind, and your heart. So thank you so much.
The emphasis on seeing aging as a positive and
absolutely. Absolutely. You get wiser for sure. But it is important to take care of our health. That is important. That should be the focus. Our brains, our health.
Thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm happy.